Hi, so I want to do a quick video that covers some stuff that I've already covered in previous videos, but I want to put it all together into one short presentation that I can use as a reference. The purpose of this video is to provide the metaphysical positioning of Adventist theology. So I put together this chart, which shows where Adventism is in terms of the different views of God, different views of reality, and different views of man. So if we have pantheism, panentheism, classical theism, process theism, open theism, and neoclassical theism for God, then Adventists would be with the neoclassical theism section. And then we're physicalists in terms of reality and monists in terms of anthropology. So our view of man is that we're composed of one single thing as opposed to having a body and a soul. Okay, so in comparison to other Christian perspectives, you have the Catholics who they would be considered classical theists, but they would follow the hylomorphism or the Aristotelian style dualism, and of course they would have a soul-body dualism as well in terms of the nature of man. Protestants, they're also tend to be classical theists. They might be either Platonic dualists or substance dualists. And I'll explain what this means in a second. And then because of that, their anthropology is also dualistic. There are some Protestants that did eventually adopt Aristotle, so there will be some who are holomorphist as well. Modern theology could be all over the place. So, for example, some might be pantheists and just have a pantheist worldview all the way through. Others might be process theologians, and a lot of times they are also pantheists in their metaphysics. A lot of times they might be classical theists, but have a physicalist view of reality, and then be monists as well. Or they might be open theists and have, either dualist or physicalist view of reality. So within more modern theology, there could be quite a combination of different views here. And again, in all this, Adventists fall on this line of neoclassical theists, physicalists, and monists. All right, so let's take a look at what each of this means. And I'm not sure if my picture here is going to get in the way. So hopefully I can move it and it still works. But I have all these different graphical representations of the different views. So pantheism basically just says that God and the world are the same thing. So we are God, God is us, the world is God, and so on. Panentheists, they say that the world is part of God, but God is greater than the world. So another way to say it is that God created the world out of his own essence, or they were together from the beginning, or however they want to look at that. So classical theists are distinguished from this other two options in that they view the created reality as separate than God. So God created things as something separate than himself. But the traditional or the classical theistic view, besides this idea of God being separate from the world, they also have the concept of divine simplicity, immutability, impassibility, and timelessness. Simplicity is very hard to explain or define. It basically says that God is composed of just one thing. He doesn't have parts. He's very simple. Of course, how that actually works in terms of God's attributes and everything, it gets really confusing. Immutability is fairly straightforward. It's basically saying that God doesn't change. So he's always exactly the same. There's no type of mutation or anyway, people understand what the word immutable means. Impassible has to do with emotions. So God doesn't have any kind of emotion. And then timelessness is also relatively easy to explain, but it's hard to conceive. It's basically saying that God doesn't exist in time. So there is no past, present, and future with God. Everything happens at once. But even the minute you say that doesn't make sense, because saying things happen at once, it's a function of time. So it's hard to describe or explain what timelessness is. But anyway, those are characteristics of the classical theistic perspective. Okay, so in contrast to that, you have process theism, which kind of rejected all those things. And one of the key features of process theism is the idea that God actually evolves. So he gets better over time. He changes, but doesn't always change. He changes and makes improvements. So he goes from worse to better. as time progresses. Then you have open theism, and open theism also rejects all these different components of classical theism, but they also reject the idea of foreknowledge. So anyway, when it comes to process theism versus open theism doesn't buy into the whole God evolves idea, but does say that God does not know the future because the future hasn't happened yet, so there's nothing to know. And then finally, the neoclassical perspective, it rejects simplicity, immutability, impassibility, timelessness. It also rejects the idea of God evolving like in process theism, but it does accept foreknowledge. So that's how neoclassical theism can be differentiated from open theism. Now, this label that I'm using, neoclassical theism, seems to be the current label that people in this group are using, but I've already noticed that other people are appropriating the term to mean something else. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do about things like this. People create labels and then somebody else comes along and steals it. So I might have to switch that label at some future point, but that's what it seems to be, that the people in this latter group seem to be using that label at this moment in time. Okay, so there's similarities and differences between the classical theistic perspective and the neoclassical theistic perspective. Both groups agree in omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and the traditional concept of God. They both see God as separate from creation. They believe in foreknowledge and things like that, but neoclassical theism rejects these concepts, which are not really are essentially just constructs that are built out of Greek philosophy that are not really meaningful so much anymore today, or at least they're not really supportable with scripture. So anyway, that's the difference between these various perspectives of God. Then when it comes to the nature of reality, pantheism and panentheism are the same, because obviously if God is one in the world, one with the world, and that's true for all these options. If panentheism is correct, then God and God is, the world is just a portion of God. Then we come into the classical theism section in the sense that God is separate than the world, but you have Platonic dualism, and Platonic dualism views the world as having two different, being built out of two different realms, so to speak, or two different types of components. One is the physical realm, and one is this immaterial realm, the realm of the forms. So it's kind of two different types of reality that are combined together, and they work together. But in a sense, they're still two separate things. So that's Platonic dualism. Anyway, I'm not explaining it as fully as I should be, but I'm trying to keep this one short. But there's a lot of information on this. Somebody wants to understand it more. Now, hylomorphism is what Aristotle came up with in response to Plato's view, and he said, no, we shouldn't think of the immaterial realm as a separate thing in a separate reality. We should just view the immaterial stuff as part of the material. So every object in the material world has certain parts that are immaterial. In other words, our senses cannot perceive it, but they help to keep the object together. So if you have a tree, there's all the physical things about the tree that we can sense and see with our eyes and touch and whatever. But then there's some kind of supernatural immaterial component to the tree that gives it its characteristics and makes it able to do whatever it needs to do. And that stuff, we don't know where it's at, but it's still part of it. So the main difference here is that hylomorphism sees the forms as part of the matter, or objects are composed of matter and form together, while Platonic dualism views each of these things in a separate realm. So there's the realm of the physical and the realm of the immaterial. Then you move forward to more modern times, and you have substance dualism or Cartesian dualism. And the idea here is that the world is more or less physicalist. In other words, it's just material. Everything in the world is material. Everything in the world is mechanistic. But the human mind or rationality, or however you want to say it, that's a separate thing. So basically, only the mind is something different, and it's immaterial. Everything else is material. And then you have just plain physicalism, where even the mind, everything is material from beginning to end. So all of created reality, it takes a material form. Then, when it comes to the nature of man, the nature of humanity, you still have pantheism and panentheism. So, for example, here man is part of God. Here, man and God are the same thing. But the traditional versions, all the different types of the different types of dualistic options that we mentioned before, when it comes to the nature of man, it's basically the body and the soul. And then you have anthropological monism, which is just the body, and the body is accountable for everything. So those are the different options, and that's what the different things mean. Now, when it comes to why Adventism chooses this perspective, basically, if we start off by rejecting anything else besides Scripture, so we reject tradition, the church councils, orthodoxy, the church fathers, any of that stuff, not because we necessarily have something against them, but because we're trying to get to the Scripture and figure out what the Scripture is saying on its own. And then if we don't start off with philosophy first, because a lot of these groups started off by processing through the philosophy, and they came to certain philosophical conclusions, and then went to Scripture and read them through that philosophical lens. So we're saying, no, let's start with Scripture, have all the philosophical options on the table, and pick the one that goes with Scripture the best, as opposed to picking one ahead of time and then going to Scripture and trying to make it fit. So we don't do philosophy first. We don't follow council's tradition, any of that stuff. We try to get straight to Scripture. We follow Scripture in its chronological sequence, because we need to allow the Scripture to build its own worldview. We don't just jump to the end and try to work backwards. So we start at the beginning and we try to figure out what the scriptural perspective is. And obviously we need to use the more modern translations, because in older translations, some of these components were already accepted by the translator, so they kind of read them into the text. So more modern translations are a little less biased when it comes to how it translates certain passages. So from the Adventist perspective, the reason why we hold this position is because when it comes to the different views of God, I would say the neoclassical perspective is 95% likely to be correct. And compared to all of them except Adventism, these two are so similar that it's harder to say that. Obviously, this one is still, in my opinion, the correct one, because the Bible does speak of divine foreknowledge, but they're a little closer together, so it's harder to give such a confidence score for that as opposed to all these other ones. But when it comes to pantheism, panentheism, classical theism, and process theism, these are philosophical constructs that anybody looking at just the biblical data, following this protocol I mentioned above, if they're unbiased, if they come to Scripture without having some preconceived idea, they're 95% likely to pick neoclassical theism as the one that lines up best with the biblical data. And I would say when it comes to reality as a whole, all these other views, except maybe substance dualism, because that one is maybe a little more difficult to tell apart. But all these other views, pantheism, panentheism, Platonic dualism, hylomorphism, it's probably 95% likely, again, that an unbiased person reading the Bible in sequence will reject those and pick the physicalist perspective. When it comes to the idea of man having a soul versus not having a soul, I would say the likelihood is less. I would say they're 60% likely to go with monism over dualism, because there are some parts of Scripture that seem to imply some kind of person going somewhere after they die, things like that. But if they follow the same protocol as I mentioned before, I would say they're still about 60% likely to go with the monist perspective. So this is why Adventism chooses this view. But again, it's a certain commitment that other Christians don't have from the beginning. In other words, the majority of Protestants already start with the idea that you're supposed to read the Bible through the lens of the church fathers. So in other words, they're not even trying to get to directly the biblical data, because they're following a different epistemology. And when it comes to Catholics and other groups, that's even more the case. So, if we intentionally follow this particular epistemology, and we follow this protocol and try to start with the Bible before we go to philosophy, I think in the majority of cases, somebody that's unbiased will arrive at the position that we're talking about here. So anyway, this is just a quick overview of what the Adventist positioning is. And by the way, I mentioned in other videos that Adventists also work with the cosmic conflict framework, and that's something else that lines up with this particular perspective, and it doesn't line up well with any of the other perspectives. So because of this, it's a little harder for people coming from many of these other views to line it up with this cosmic conflict view. So all these things kind of play together. And then once people start with this basic framework of understanding this metaphysical framework plus the cosmic conflict as an overarching storyline, plus the commitment to the biblical data alone and without any outside elements, all the other things that Adventists believe tend to flow naturally from there. So this becomes like the theoretical foundation, and then things develop from there. Anyway, so this is a quick overview of what I mean when I use any of this terminology and where the Adventist perspective is positioned in the middle of all these other views. Now, I would say that when it comes to Christian theology, especially in an academic setting, there should be somebody working on this, whether people agree with these concepts or not, because there's people working on all these other options. So there should be somebody looking to see what Christian theology looks like if we approach it from this particular views, neoclassical deism, physicalism, monism, and all that. So, and it's a theoretical space that somebody needs to occupy. So it might as well be us, even irrespective of the fact that this is the one which seems to line up better with the biblical data. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say for this one. Hopefully clarify some things if somebody ever has questions as to what I mean by some of these ideas.